Hello and welcome. My name is Steven Sorensen. I'm the creator of Ctruth, and this is Scholarly Snippets, Season 2, Episode 3. Scholarly Snippets is my show where I interview people with history degrees or related degrees in order to shed light on the world of history and historical scholarship. Today, I am joined by the psychologist Dr. Shalini Dixit. According to her LinkedIn, she obtained a master's degree in psychology in 2005, and in 2012, she obtained a PhD in psychology, with her thesis being the development of historical understanding in children. She published her book, The Psychology of Teaching Critical History, earlier this year in 2021. As you watch, think of questions that you would have asked her that I didn't ask. Then comment those questions so I can get a better view of what you want to hear from my guests. Without further ado, here's the interview. Shalini, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to have this conversation with me. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
That's good to hear. So you got your PhD, the central topic of it was the psychology of history, correct?
Correct, yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about what that is? It's somewhat of a field of its own.
Yes, it's kind of a field which I think I figured out. I have a master's in history. I have a master's in psychology, and I'm interested in past. So when I started thinking about the topic for my research after my master's degree, I was introduced to historiography. Like how historians do past, how they engage with history. And during that process, I realized that there is a lot of psychology that needs to be understood about how people engage with past. So that's when I decided to do psychology of history.
Yeah, it's an interesting field, and it is very historiographic, where you're learning about how the historian is thinking and how they're interacting with the past. So could you tell us a bit about how history differs from the past, the events which have occurred?
So history, as you all know, is a study of issues related to human life and society in past. And what a historian does is, beside locating events in past, the historian tries to understand patterns and causes and effects and, connections between events. And she does all this in a way that it is verifiable. It has some valid sources of information. That becomes history. There are other reasons why a piece of past becomes history, but these are some methodological reasons. Whereas past is everything that has happened previously. It could be important for me as my family history, or it could be important for me as a community, the past of my community. So although it is past, and although it is collective past, several times it doesn't become history. So what we study as history is only a selected body of knowledge about past, which has been arrived at in a certain methodological base. So, and there is a lot of psychology there, as I said, that why and how some pieces of information become past and some become history. And what do we do as individuals, as societies? What do we do with the piece of past which we consider relevant, but we don't find them being validated as history? So my work has largely been around that explorations.
So it sort of centers around the history that didn't make the cut, so to say.
Yes, in a way, yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's to find more representation, but so history is interesting. What can you say about the historian's mind? How does it differ from other people's minds?
So history is a subject which is not available for our current exploration. So to make science scientific, what we do, we find empirical observations and we find objective methods to verify its validity. Whereas in history, events have already occurred. So historians cannot see past directly. We cannot observe, categorize, and classify. But what a historian does is she depends on various sources, which could be, artifacts, writings, photographs, narratives. And in doing this, she has to analyze these sources and build her own story of past. In doing this, we can see that a historian is relying upon some small clues to understand the bigger picture and reality. So she weaves this thread of pieces together. In doing this, historian is partly a detective, trying to understand the social dynamics, partly a social scientist, trying to understand the causality of relationships, also trying to understand the time distances, and sometimes acting as a statistician and mathematician to understand the economic aspects of life. So whatever aspect of life a historian gets into, she has to understand that entire area. So therefore history is a very interdisciplinary subject, and a historian's mind has to understand all those complex reality and transfer herself to that past reality while being in present. So we can see that there are several skills that a historian is using, several cognitive skills, several personality-related skills, which are applied when we engage with history. And in my study with children, actually, I have found that there are several aspects of being a historian. For example, empathy, understanding what happened with people in past, people who were struck by some trauma or war. People differ on these skills. Not all of us are as empathic, and not all of us are imaginative. Equally imaginative. So I saw a lot of difference between children in terms of how easily they could transmit themselves to past. So that's very interesting. Yeah.
What was that last sentence that you just said?
How easily could children transmit themselves to past? So in my
transport, how easily they can place themselves in the past to empathize with the people from them. That is interesting. An interesting result. You've done quite a lot of work with children. Has been a core part of your education and research, correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for giving that answer. So it's sort of, historians have to be the jack of all trades. They kind of have to have their foot in every door to understand a bit of how the mind is, because that is what it is like what you were saying. They use sources, they try to get the best information that they can to get insight into the issues that they're looking at or the events that they're investigating. They do have to kind of be a detective. So yeah, it's a big wheelhouse that the historian is occupying. What are some of your opinions on how historians have done, or on different representations of the past?
Yeah, it's not historians alone who are responsible for various representations of past. Past actually is represented in our society in several ways. For example, memorials, museums, commemorative ceremonies. We celebrate annual days. Those are also representations of past. These are some of the officially sanctioned way of representing past, but there are other ways like folk stories, mythologies. These are all ways in which communities have preserved and carried forward their knowledge about their past. And as I said, history is just one of the ways in which past is represented. So what history in general has done is that it has excluded other modes of representation of past. So other ways of representation has been excluded, and has uh, uh, that has reasons in the nationalism, in the other broader political scenario, rather than only the choice of historians.
So, different representations have been marginalized, different mediums. What other types? So, I think most people, when they think of history, they're thinking of dusty books that have been penned over many years. But just book narrative form, sort of like that. What are some other modes of representation that are out there?
So I'll tell you a story. When I, as you might have seen, that I have worked with the Adivasi community, which is Aboriginal. We have several Aboriginal communities in India. And I went to study because I was interested in, as a student of psychology, I was interested in finding cultural differences in terms of understanding past. So I found one urban community, children staying in cities, and I wanted to have a comparison with the children who are coming from one of these communities. So I went to one of the Aboriginal communities in a state called Jharkhand in India. When I went there, I started asking people about their past, about their history, and I realized that they didn't have anything to share with me. They started sharing that what do you want to know? We don't want to tell you any stories. We just have stories. And those stories, when I said, yes, tell me those stories, I'm interested. Yes, they laughed, and they said, if you really want to know truth, you should look at books and not come to us. I said, but you follow those stories, isn't it? They said, yes, they are very important for us. So, I changed my questions. I started staying with them. I started doing some kind of ethnographic exploration into the historical consciousness of these communities. And I was amazed to find that the kind of narratives, songs, explanations they had for each function, event that they did. So I asked them, what will happen if you don't do this particular festival in this way? Oh, no. We will have a particular kind of rain. We will have our crops going bad, and we will have our people falling sick if we don't do that. I said, who told this to you? Nobody told. It's there. We all know it. It has always happened from the times in past. I said, yes, so that's what I'm interested in. Please tell me more about it. And this is how they gradually started talking about their past and their history. But whenever I asked them, okay, so tell me if there is a history which is given in your textbook, because these are the people whose children were going to school now. So the elderly of the community didn't have much of the schooling experiences, but their children were going to schools. So I asked them, which history do you think is correct? The one that you're telling me, or the one which is there in the books? I was very amazed to find that they said both. They didn't say that one is better or one is, more authentic. There was some variation in terms of their education level. So if a tribal was completely uneducated or had a university degree, then they would say our community history are true and we are being taught all this kind of history. But if they had a mid-level of education where they have dropped out from the school after going to school for a couple of years, then they would not take a stand. They will remain in between. But interestingly, the eldest of the community, who should have believed in their community history completely, they didn't say that this is the only history we should carry forward. When I asked them, which history do you think your children should study? They said, it's possible to have different histories. Why not let our children study this history also? They should know about this, and they should study school history also. Although they had concern, because they had livelihood concern, they said if our children study only our history, they will not get jobs. That was also one of the reasons that they were ready to be very inclusive, I feel. But in general also, the communities who have not been in the mainstream, or who have a certain kind of knowledge system, I see, especially in Indian indigenous communities, are quite inclusive. They don't want to categorically say this version or that version. Because I also ask them, suppose there are two versions of history which are both not there in the school. What will you do? Which one will you believe? They said, we'll believe both. For me, my history is important. These were the very sentence which I heard several times during my stay in the field. They said, for me, my history is important. For somebody else, their version could be important. So we can have both together. Yeah.
Yep. Thanks for sharing that story. You talk about a bit of that in your newest book, the Psychology of Teaching Critical History. That's the title.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, it's a good read. I recommend it for anybody that wants to check it out. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. I had asked the different modes of representation. Just to summarize what I kind of heard, you were talking about how this indigenous community that you were interviewing, they were talking about they preferred the information in the books, but they also were familiar with their own traditions, and they were accepting of having multiple narratives. They have their history that is personal and meaningful to them, and they can understand or even empathize with other people that they have their own histories that are important to them as well. And so, would it be almost, I think that's somewhat of a good stance to take. It's respectful towards other people, and it acknowledges that there are different types of history out there, different stories that are told, and some people might not believe the same story that you do. And I think that's a good thing to believe in. So I do appreciate you sharing that story. As far as historical understanding goes, that's kind of what we've been talking about, how people make sense of history and what effects it has on the mind. If I'm not mistaken, it was 2009 or so when you first published your 4-dimensional model of historical understanding with Ajit Mohanty is, I think, his name. What were some of the things that led to you creating that?
Oh, yeah. So as I told you, I got interested into history during the process of finding my research topic. When I decided I will study this, Ajit Mohanty was my doctoral supervisor. And he said, there is no work in this area. You can't do this. It's almost close to impossible to research in such areas where you don't have any literature. And of course, as you might have figured out, there was no field called psychology of history. So I didn't have a beginning point. But I was interested. So I said, okay, let me figure out a way. So I went into the epistemology and knowledge creation. I said, should a knowledge not be created if there is no knowledge in that area? And with that understanding, I started reading history books. I read books on philosophy of history. I read postmodernist history literature. I read historiography. And I wanted to list cognitive processes which a historian engages with. Now, how did I do that? When a historian was talking about, this is what a historian does. For example, E.H. Carr in What is History, or Collingwood for that matter. When they are talking about historians' acts, I could infer that when a historian is doing this, she is basically engaging in this particular cognitive activity. So I derived corresponding cognitive activities while reading the activities of historian through historiography books. And I made a list of about 35 cognitive activities that historians did. And this was through this historiography literature. When I showed that list to my supervisor, he had given me 15 days to prove that I can work in this area. And when I showed that list to him, he was very happy. He was excited, and he said, "Wow, this is amazing! And I think I take my words back. You can go ahead and work in this area." So that was the beginning, and then later on, I discussed with several other historians who were doing well in the field, established ones, and then I tried to organize them into overlapping themes, categorize them, classify them, and with this process, I reached at these 13 aspects, 4 dimensions, and remaining sub-dimensions of the historical understanding.
That is a great story. What are the 4 dimensions for people who aren't familiar with them?
So the 4 dimensions are, first is temporality, because history primarily concerns itself with past. Within temporality, we have 2 more dimensions, whether the child is able to connect with past or connecting past with the numbers, chronology. Those are 2 sub-dimensions. Next dimension is causality. So history essentially consists of understanding cause and effect and relationships, understanding critical connection between several factors which lead to an event. That's causality. Third dimension of historical understanding is methodology. A very important aspect of understanding history is also understanding how history has been constructed, because history is always reconstructed. So it is imperative that children should be told how history is constructed. Apart from how history is constructed, there are also mental ways in which history is constructed. For example, we take help of imagination. We do a lot of perspective taking. All these aspects are part of the dimension methodology. The 4th dimension is understanding historian's job. So in this dimension, I talk about how there are different sources of analysis. There are different sources of information about past, and how a historian uses those sources to arrive at their version of past, and what makes them prioritize which source of information is to be taken. So that's So that's a part of understanding historian's job. So these are the 4 methods essentially: temporality, causality, methodology, and understanding historian's job.
Thank you for so concisely summarizing that. It is really fascinating. I think it's comprehensive. I'm glad that you had published it, that you spent the time coming up with that. It's really useful. I love the simplicity of it. I think that it's great because it is for developing on how to teach children history. I think is what you were working for. But even for adults that are not historically literate, so to say, they haven't had any formal training, or they haven't really spent much time looking into the discipline, it just very neatly summarizes the aspects of history and how we understand the past and the narratives that we're reading. So thanks again for creating that, even, and for coming on here to talk about it. What's been your favorite part of your journey so far in this field that you basically created? If I'm not misunderstanding you, you were saying that your professor was saying there's no literature in this field, and so you've put your flag in the ground and declared it the psychology of history. What's been your favorite part so far?
Oh yes, this journey has been fantastic, Stephen. Actually, as a child, I always used to be intrigued with the stories of past. And in India, as you know, we have a very long history, right from ancient times to colonial and modern history. In all these parts, whenever I used to study, I used to wonder, is this all about that time? What else was happening around that time? So if I was studying about colonial rule, I used to be also moved by the stories of struggles and challenges that people faced. But I always used to wonder what more was happening around these people that led to these incidences. And we of course, in history, as I said, we only read selected body of knowledge. We don't read all, and it's also not possible, not feasible to read all. But it's the question which always remained with me, that there's a lot that we don't know about past. Is it really possible ever to know about past completely? It was so mysterious to not know and to keep thinking, what more can I know? And and there was only psychology. There was nothing else I was doing right from my childhood, but I didn't know I was doing psychology. It's only when I gave a name and shape to it, I realized that it is psychology. So there is a lot of psychology in doing history, in thinking about past, that we all do. And that's the most attractive part for me, that we don't know everything about past. So that brings a lot of humility and humbleness with which we should look at past, rather than being sure and radical about it. Because one strand of my recent work in this area has been to understand how several versions of past lead to intergroup conflict. So intergroup conflict is definitely a result of this conclusive thinking about past. So there are several aspects about this field which actually keeps me glued to it even now, and I'm sure I'm going to work in this even for a longer period from now on, to understand how communities maintain their past, how people fight for their past, how children understand past. Yeah, all these things together keep me going.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, you really enjoyed the mystery of it all, being able to learn more, to explore the dark corridors of history, and it's that sense of adventure, even I feel it coming through. So thanks for sharing that. You're talking about how future research might revolve around conflicts generated by conceptions of the past, which if your future research is anything like the prior research, it'll be fantastic. So I am looking forward to whatever you put out later. What are some challenges that you face here? I would imagine maybe going into the dark is somewhat challenging, not in a well-established field so far. Could you tell me more about that?
Knowledge exploration part was not as much difficult as finding a reviewer and finding a job. So since there is no field, people didn't know where to place me. People didn't know where to find a reviewer for me, for my work, because it involved both psychology and history and politics to a large extent. And it's difficult to find all these combinations together. And at the end, I'm talking about education. So I essentially was an educationist. I was working in a center for education, in my doctoral work. So when I went for interviews, people used to tell me, you're more suitable for psychology. Psychology people used to tell me I'm more suitable for education. But it lasted for some time, but the work had been getting me considerable acclaim also. I won a Best Doctoral Dissertation Award for the year 2013 based on this work only. So although there were challenges, but they were actually fun to overcome, and it was very rewarding to go through those challenges.
So it was challenging for employment, for trying to find where your place was, but in the end, it was a good challenge to have. These were milestones to complete.
Yeah,
that's great. Are there any controversies in the field? Are people arguing about what's the best way to teach history to children? There are
actually in most of the countries where we have conflicting histories, we have these issues and discussions about which version of past to teach. whether should we, and we all know that when governments change, and if there has been, like you see, Soviet Russia, in South Korea, in India, all these countries, we have this governments changing. Whenever governments change, they want to bring their version of past, because they have because past is instrumental for nation state, and the kind of past you have, you project that kind of nation. So governments are very keen on teaching their versions of past. Now, what happens in this process is that if we go by one version or the other, children actually don't get the real sense of history. And that is why I propose teaching a critical history, which does not go by one or the other version of past, but it goes by past as a discipline, by understanding past as multiple realities, and by inculcating critical skills in children to enable them to understand past holistically, rather than blindly following one version over the other. So these are controversial areas, and people keep, if you explore the news reports in India these days, we have government which is considered to be right wing and have a Hindu nationalist agenda for building a nation which is completely Hindu, and therefore they are trying to modify and correct past or history of our country in a way which suits that agenda. And my book talks about how it's not a wise thing to teach children these kind of biased history, be it any version. And I talk about that children should be able to rise over these differences, and they should be able to accept these differences.
I agree with that. So the controversies are pitted in the different narratives that are competing for the top shelf in the textbook. Do we teach them A model or B model, the conflicting narratives even? And what you're arguing for is that you should be teaching school children how to think, how they should be learning about the discipline of the past and how we look into it and understand it and how these narratives came to be, instead of just showing them. It's like instead of watching a movie or seeing the director's cut and how it's all put together, and somewhat like that, they're seeing behind the scenes, everything that's happening before the presentation is shown. So I think that's good too, for people to understand. Have you had arguments against that? Are there people who do not want children to know how history is written or how the past is studied?
So first of all, I'm trying to say that what you said about how to teach, teaching children the methodology of history, but I'm not against teaching versions. What I'm saying is that do teach versions, but enable children to be critical of those versions. That's critical history. What you said is more about an approach called disciplinary approach to teach history. There are 2-3 ways in which history has been generally taught. One is a collective memory approach or a narrative approach, in which a country presents one linear version of history to represent their nation state. 2 is disciplinary approach, what you explained. And 3 is a postmodernist approach, wherein we teach children that there is multiple possibilities. There are multiple possibilities, and all possibilities are correct. That's postmodernist way of teaching. My stand is somewhere between second and third, between disciplinary and postmodernist approach. Because as you rightly guessed, that if we only teach methodologies and if we only teach the behind the scene realities, past has a certain function for identity building also. If we I mean, as a human being, as a child, I have a need to know about my past because it helps me in forming my identity, in placing where I belong in the wider network of society. And if we only do disciplinary way of teaching, in which we teach methods only, those needs may not be fulfilled. And I'm sure even nation states will not find any benefit in teaching a history which is only methodological. They also have, I mean, nations have their need, and the need is to have a unitary vision about the past. My point is, first of all, unitary vision of past is anyways difficult to achieve because in a diverse society, you have various sources through which past seeps into the child. So even if one teaches a version of history, children are learning about it. Then there are people who have done a lot of research in this area in US and in Estonia and several countries where people have seen that it is not possible for a country to maintain a very isolated narrative of history. So what is the solution here? The solution is to, of course, present some sections, some selections, but the pedagogy of history should be such which allows children to bring their community histories in the classroom, which are cherished, which are valued, and which is teaching not just about history, but it is also teaching democratic values to children. They are learning to be critical, but they are learning to be accepting the diversity. And in this way, if we teach these values and diversity, then the question about national integrity is addressed because we are building inclusive and tolerant children. Rather than teaching them single version and then trying to achieve this impossible task of national unity, we can teach acceptance for diversity, which is more democratic and which is more doable, which is more close to reality, because reality is diverse. They are learning about several versions through different sources.
So to summarize all that, you're arguing that children do benefit from learning the narrative structure of history, also learning the methodologies. So really it is the four dimensional model of historical understanding to get a little bit of everything in there. And children are able to learn this. And it was interesting reading about the developmental stages and trying to find correlations between what ages children can actually start to comprehend some of these abstract concepts of time and causation and things like that. So yeah, thank you for sharing all that. The idea of history playing into nation building is also important, maybe more important than some people realize. It gives a sense of identity. Another thing I remember from your book, I think, was that the textbooks, they aren't really the main source of information for concepts of history. There are a lot of local histories, indigenous histories, the familial histories, even possibly even personal histories. Just the one person thinks it, but so that's all interesting. What are some other main routes where people were getting their history from? I think you talked a little bit about this in your studies that you did here, your interviews.
So yeah, community histories are the another important source from where people get to learn about their history. There are commemorative ceremonies which could not be national or not be shared by wider communities. But in my own community, I, as an individual, could learn about things which my family considers to be true about our past. And there are close groups of communities. When they meet, they discuss about their past. Not all the communities have these circles or narratives, and not all of them are so close also, because most of them are also part of the mainstream society. So they consider the national narrative to be the true history, because there is no separate history that they want to carry forward. So they take those textbook versions. But in the case of other communities, for example, if you have stories of kings who fought with Mughals in India, you will find several uh, uh, tribal communities who have helped these kings in fighting with those Mughal kings. But those stories do not figure out. Now, if you go and talk to them, so for example, in Rajasthan is one of the states where we have Rajput and kings. You talk to them, they will share stories, and they will share it with so confident that you have read this in history textbooks. It was my a great grandparent who helped the king organize those elephants that he used. It was my community who supplied the armory to them. So there are several such narratives which are held held by the communities, and they still carry it forward. They maintain it, and they take pride in holding and sharing those communities. They assert their identity through those memories, their collective memories. It's actually these things that got me interested into collective memory. In my second book, I'm working on collective memory.
Is that the next book coming out? Can you share any details about that?
No, I'm just planning a bit. I'm trying to see how different communities maintain their community histories in while they are interacting with the mainstream histories.
That's
I haven't elaborated. It's an edited book. It's not my self-authored book. It's going to be an edited book, but I'll have a couple of chapters myself in that book.
And so, what is collective memory?
It's the cultural memory of past, which is held by a group of people who find some commonality amongst themselves. I, as a Hindu practitioner of Hindu religion, may have some of the mythologies which I feel is part of my genesis. For example, Ramayana or Mahabharata. So these are mythological texts which define Hindu religious identity even now. When people talk to each other, they say, you should not behave in this way because, Lord Krishna told us not to do so. And when he says that, he refers to a living entity. He doesn't refer to God all the time. He's referring to a living entity who was my past. There are several such narratives and understandings about the common past that we have had. They also do not become part of the history, but they define our lived realities. They define how we interpret things around us. So that part of history or past is what we call collective memory.
Thanks for clarifying that. And so your future book is going to be about how those collective memories hold up against the mainstream narratives. Is that what you're saying? What defines a mainstream narrative?
A narrative which is endorsed by the state, which gets its placed in the books, school textbooks and the university textbooks.
And so these collective memories, they conflict with the state narratives on occasion?
On occasions, yes. Not always.
Right.
Some of them do find place in books.
And so your next book is going to be about these conflicts and how they hold up, or it will also include the ones that are in line with what the state is saying?
No, it's mostly about the minorities who are holding these histories and how they are negotiating the realities. When I believe that past is multiple, which past do I believe in? Which past do I use when I interact with the member of other community? And which past do I switch to when I interact with a member of my community?
So do you think there is such a thing as pseudo history, or like history that's fake? I guess you accept that people do make stuff up for history. There's forgers, deceivers out there. People pull hoaxes on others, but is pseudo history a real thing, do you think?
It's happening in India. So we have Hindu nationalists who want to push these mythological versions of past to say that this was history. So you may like to call it a pseudo history. I would call it different representation of past.
I do find it somewhat of a derogatory term for referring to someone else's, but I think sometimes people use it to refer to history that's based upon methods or grounds that are shakier than others. But I personally don't find it to be a useful term for referring to people's presentations of the past. So I do appreciate you sharing your ideas on that. The Hindu nationalists, it's not something that I am too familiar with, but we have nationalists as well here in the States, so I'm sure there's some crossover between the nationalism. Yeah. Well, we are gonna be wrapping it up here soon. Have you ever thought about getting another degree? Pursuing maybe a different PhD or get another master's?
No. If at all, I missed studying history at length because I have a major in psychology, as I said. But then I compensated by reading on my own. I read a lot of historiography and history.
So one time through was enough for getting the degrees. No, yeah, you're in a very interesting field. I really enjoy the work that you're doing, so I hope that you stick with it. I hope to see it expand. I'm hoping that other people will get interested in it. It's something that I've thought about a lot in the back of my head, and then when I found your book put together, it was amazing to see the time and effort that you've put into it. So I do again recommend anybody that can try and read that book. It's awesome. Shalini, I give everybody a chance on this show to leave a message for people who are just starting to get interested in history. They've maybe looked a little bit into it. Maybe they've gotten a copy of your book already, but they haven't read all of it. What's your message to those individuals who are just starting to foster a love for history or the psychology of history?
History is our memory. And being a psychologist, being somebody who understands history, I would say that let's not trust our memories blindly. Because as a psychologist, I know that memories are created. They change and they are interpreted differently at different times. And same is true for history. So when we start understanding this field, or irrespective of what stage are we at in understanding this discipline, we must be critical. We must use our tools of questioning, comparing, and accepting all the possible versions and interpretations of reality before accepting any. I mean, we are free to hold two memories of the same incidents, but that will require a lot of effort individually. So although as an individual, we have need to hold on to and cling to our memories, but we must revisit our memories and be critical. That's all I want to say.
So to summarize, be critical, be thorough, and don't be too quick to accept one thing over the other. I think that's a great message. Shalini, thanks for joining me today. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you, Stephen. I enjoyed talking to you a lot.
Thanks goes out to everybody who watched. Be sure to drop any other questions you wish I had asked in the comment section below. Before I go, I owe the Ctruth patrons a huge thanks for their continued support in my endeavor to explore and map the world of chronology. Thank you all. For anyone who's not a Ctruth patron yet, click the link in the description to gain access to exclusive Ctruth activities, benefits, and content. At the end of this season, I'll be posting a number of polls for you to vote on to choose your favorite guest from this season, your favorite question that was asked, and to nominate a guest for next season. You'll also be able to have a name added to the list of patrons at the end of every episode. Before you go, like the video, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment, and check out these other videos.